Welcome back. This is another one of Allison's questions. Her questions was, how do we know what settings to use? And so this is kind of part B of the 3 different lighting settings. So we're talking today about shutter speed. And last time we talked about aperture being the eyeball of the camera, and we pulled out our spaghetti. Today we're pulling out our fan. Literally bought this for the Miss Teen Utah USA headshots because they wanted the windblown look. So I happen to have this little fan. I took the front off of it, so I'm going to be very careful not to stick my fingers in there. I want you to find a fan. It can even be a ceiling fan if you want to lay on your bed for this exercise, or I recommend a standing fan of some kind. And we're actually going to have it on. So what is shutter speed? Shutter speed in your camera, it's another way that we let light in and out of our camera. And we talked about aperture being in the lens. Shutter speed is in the camera. Every camera has a shutter. It's like a door. So the shutter in a camera, and this is a film camera, so your DSLR is not going to look like this, and it's even a little bit of a different technology. But these little doors, don't touch them if you have a working film camera. This one doesn't work. They will go up and down to let light in to your lens or into your sensor, into your film, because this is a film camera. So the light comes in from here, the film sits here, these doors open based on how long you set your settings for, and they expose your film, and your DSLR works the same way. Your lens is here, your light comes in through here, there's a shutter between here and your sensor. The shutter opens, light does its thing on your sensor to make the image. So it lets light in. Obviously, the longer that door is open, the more light is coming into your camera and impacting your sensor or your film. The less amount of time that your shutter is open, there is less light coming into your film or your sensor. So that's what our shutter does. So if we talk about what that means as far as light, so we talked the same thing with aperture. Aperture lets in light, but it also impacts depth of field. Shutter speed also has 2 things that it impacts. It impacts blur on a moving subject. So if you think about the amount of time that shutter is open, the light is recording an image the entire time. So if your shutter is open for 30 seconds, anything that happens in that 30 seconds while your shutter is open is being recorded on your sensor. So think of 30 seconds as 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. Unless you have an absolutely stationary subject, there's going to be blur recorded in your image. Think about that for a minute. As we are now going to do our little exercise, if we look at these fan blades that I just about stuck my finger in, our next episode will be first aid. I'm going to turn it off for a minute. So what we're going to do, the first thing I want you to do is you're going to set your camera to SV or TV. It depends on your camera. It stands for timed value or shutter value. And just like it did with AV, shutter, the SV, lets you change your shutter speed. The computer in your camera sets your ISO and your aperture to make sure that the lighting scenario is perfect, so that your exposure, the amount of light in your image, is perfect compared to what the camera thinks. So it's important to know how your camera is showing the different settings and what they mean. If we look here, I'm at 1/100th of a second. I can change it, and as we go faster, that number's getting bigger, so we're at 1/6400th of a second, which is really, really fast. Or we can go down past the fractions of a second and go to seconds. So now we're at 1/3 of a second, the little inch mark, and now we're at 3 seconds. So we can go all the way down to 30 seconds. What I want you to do is set your camera to 30 seconds, but before you push the shutter release button, this is really important. The opening and the closing of this door, it's going to be 30 seconds. You're going to think that you broke your camera. You're going to hear the door open, and then nothing is going to happen for 30 seconds. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. That's a long time to not hear your camera doing anything. You won't be able to manipulate any of the buttons. You won't be able to do anything. You're going to think you broke your camera. You did not. Just wait 30 seconds, and then you'll hear the door shut on your little shutter, and your picture is taken. So we're gonna do that, and I'm just gonna keep talking for a minute. Oh, let's turn on our fan. So I push the button and it's broken. I just totally broke my camera. So while this is broken, we're gonna talk about shutter speed a little bit. Obviously, how many times is this moving in the amount of time that this is open for 30 seconds? I'm gonna grab my notes because I wanna talk about math for a minute, and I don't wanna talk about math without looking at my notes. Okay.
Is your hand in front of the lens?
Nope.
Oh.
It's just literally still calculating.
Well, I just didn't know if you put your hand in it while it was taking the picture.
Oh, possibly. But it's not gonna matter. So there's my 30 seconds.
Yeah, because it's blown out.
And that's what my image looks like, yeah, so it wouldn't matter. But if I did put my hand in front of the camera, it would document. That's why it's so important to understand, and that's maybe a good point, is I could maybe set it to 15 seconds so I'm not so blown out, and I could literally pass my hand in front of it and you'll get a little ghost hand, because anything that happens in front of that lens while your shutter is open is being recorded on your sensor. So that's why shutter speed is so important. So as we look at the 1/10 of a second versus 1/3 of a second, what does that all mean? I kind of had to do like some mathing. Okay, so before we talk about what happened with those 30 seconds and what it looks like on our viewfinder, I want to talk about the way that your camera marks things. You'll see a 1-6, a 1/6 of a second, and you'll also see a 6.6. They're not the same. 1/6 of a second is actually 0.16 seconds. You need to remember, if our camera could go all the way to 250 seconds, 250 is not the same as 1/250th of a second. 1/250th of a second is 0.004 seconds. And yes, I'm looking at my notes. I'm not math smart, so I had to actually write it down and do the math. Whereas 250 seconds is 250 seconds. So we need to know what your camera is showing. Mine will literally show a 1 and then a slash and then the number 250 for a fraction of a second, and it will show, well, let's say like 30, and then it'll show like a quotation mark. So that's 30 seconds. So we need to make sure that as we're doing this little study that you know the difference between a fraction of a second in your camera and an actual second. Let's look at our viewfinder with our 30 seconds. So it took a long time. We thought we broke our camera, and it looks like that. I don't even know if we froze the fan blades, because 30 seconds is a really, 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 really long time to have your shutter open, and we have all these house lights on, and we have our video light that's so huge and powerful, and we totally just blew out that image. When we look at this, it's telling me that f/22, the smallest our aperture can be, the least amount of light that this camera can absolutely let in at that aperture, is still going to let in too much light if our door is open for 30 seconds. It even has our ISO as low as it can absolutely positively go, and we're still way too bright. It's blinking, it's telling me this isn't gonna work. So let's move our shutter speed a little slower. We're gonna go down to 10. So as our little warning, it's still telling me at f/22, it needs to go a smaller opening to even have this exposure right. So I'm gonna take the picture. We know the fan is not gonna freeze in this picture. So 10 seconds a little bit slower or a little bit quicker. It's not gonna, our door, little door shutter is not gonna be open as long. We're seeing a little bit more in the picture. We're starting to see the brick and stuff. A lot of you will have a camera that you'll be able to hear the distinct click of the shutter opening, and then 10 seconds later, the distinct click of the shutter closing. You didn't hear that on my mirrorless. So now let's go down to, I'm gonna go all the way to 2 seconds. And at this point, I'm going to turn our fan back on, because we can obviously see that the camera's not giving me that warning anymore. Well, it still kind of is blinking. So we're still gonna be a little bit overexposed, but I wanna see the blur in the camera now. And we're gonna take the picture, and it's still like a fairly long time, but definitely you can hear the click there. If we look at the image, it's not super blown out, but it definitely is not freezing the fan blades. You can't see a distinct fan blade, it's just one big blur. So we're gonna go up to, and our f/22 is blinking, we're gonna go until the f/22 stops blinking. Oh, there we go. So 1/8 of a second, still blinking at me. 1/6 of a second. Let's take this picture and see if we are gonna capture that blur. And I want to look at them side by side. So it's a little bit brighter because we were past that point where our aperture could keep up with us. And now our aperture is at a good point, but we still can't really see the blades at all. Let's go to 1/10 of a second. And now we're not going to be able to hear a distinct click between the two opening and closing. It's just going to be one sound. But we still really can't see any action freezing. But still, if you think about 1/10 of a second, and these blades are probably spinning at more than that. 300th of a second? I don't know. So let's go to f1.25. It's now saying that our aperture, to keep our exposure just right, our aperture is as low as this specific lens will let me go. So I think our next picture, we'll see that it's going to start changing our ISO for us because now our door isn't open as long, so we're not letting as much light in. So let's see what it's doing for us, freezing the motion wise. Oh, we're starting to see some fan shapes in there. Okay, so let's go up a few more stops and see. Now it's changing our ISO. Our aperture is as wide open as it can get, and our shutter is opening and closing really fast, so it's having to compensate by increasing our ISO, which we'll talk about in another segment. Oh, we're getting there. Okay, let's go even faster. 12/50th of a second, f2.8, ISO is at 1000. Still not quite in focus. They're starting to freeze, so I'm gonna go 1/6400th of a second. We're getting there. I wanna zoom in and see. Center is a little still out of focus. So let's go one more notch. Well, that's as far as it'll let us go. So that's exactly what we'll do. I would dare say that at 1/8000th of a second, we've frozen motion. If we could go higher on our shutter speed, eventually what would happen is the same thing that happened with our aperture. We would have that door opening and closing so fast that our ISO wouldn't be able to keep up and our picture would start to just get darker and darker and darker and darker. There's our shutter speed experiment. I want you to take your notebook. I want you to write things down. I want you to write thoughts that come to your mind, aha, little moments that come to your mind as we were doing this exercise. Please subscribe to our channel and click the bell so that you receive notifications when we post our next video. And we will see you next time when we actually combine our aperture and our shutter speed together. Have an awesome day. Goodbye.